Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium for Tuesday, April 6, 2021. Thank you for joining us on this lovely spring afternoon. And I'll be introducing our program in just a minute. But first, wanted to tell you what's happening next week. Our guest will be journalist and author Mark Johnson, who's a familiar figure in Idaho politics and journalism, was a press secretary to Idaho's last Democratic governor, Cecil Andrus, in the 1990s. He'll be talking about his new book called The Tuesday Night Massacre: 4 Senate Elections and the Radicalization of the Republican Party, focusing on the 1980 Senate race between Frank Church and Steve Sims, which is seen as sort of a tipping point in Idaho politics. So I hope you will join us then. I'm repeating the call for proposals for our fall semester series as we begin our 21st year of the Renfrew Colloquium. And we would welcome your nominations and self-nominations, and a special appeal to anyone who would have been part of the initial colloquium series in the fall of 2001. We would love to have you come back and revisit the research or creative activity or teaching that you were describing 20 years ago that fall. You can just email me for more information, kbird@uidaho.edu. Today, we have an interdisciplinary team that stretches across 3 colleges, CNR, College of Education, Health and Human Sciences, and Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences, as well as the Idaho EPSCoR office. And we're delighted to have Philip Stevens, Vanessa Anthony-Stevens, Karla Eitel, and Sarah Penney, all part of our team of presenters today. Their topic, which they'll tell us a little bit more about, is co-constructing Indigenous research and leadership in STEM education. And I think I see Philip, if you want to go ahead and start, and then you can turn it over to the other presenters as we go forward.
Okay, so sorry about that. Yeah, I'm having a little technical difficulties, so I might turn over for Vanessa right now, and I might drop out and sign back in. Right now, I'm doing this on my phone. I'm trying to get it onto my computer. So sorry about that.
No problem. Okay, Vanessa, over to you.
Thanks. Good afternoon. As Kenton Bird mentioned, I'm Vanessa Anthony-Stevens. I'm faculty in curriculum and instruction, and I'm thrilled to be part of a team that's going to share with you some of the work that we're doing around interdisciplinary research and STEM practices broadly. And before we do that, I just want to allow everyone to briefly introduce themselves. So I'll pass to Karla.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to share our work today. So I'm Karla Eitel. I am the director of the McCall Field Campus, faculty in the College of Natural Resources. My specialization is in place-based and community-based education models. And I'm a mother to 2 rascals and a wife, as well as being a scholar. Let's pass it to Sarah.
Hello, my name is Sarah Penney. I'm with Education Outreach Diversity Office in Idaho EPSCoR program. I'm also a member of the Nez Perce Tribe of Idaho. And I've been with EPSCoR for about 12 years now. And we have a goal of broadening participation. And so I'm very excited to be on this team. Thank you.
And Philip, I don't know if you've signed back in yet and are able to present yourself. If not, we can come back to you, or I can present you.
There he is.
Okay, we'll give him a moment. I'm gonna go ahead and screen share, and I believe I have that power. And I think you all can see our slides right now. Philip, if you want to introduce yourself briefly. Not yet. Okay, we can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. Sorry about this. There's a lot of things going on and I'm doing it off my phone, so we'll go with that. Yeah, my name is Philip Stevens. I'm a member of the St. Carlos Apache tribe. I'm a professor in anthropology and sociology. And I'm also the director of American Indian Studies. I'm originally from Arizona.
So Philip, I'll go ahead and introduce this slide. So we are here today, as we mentioned, as a collaborative team that both is working among ourselves across units in our own university, but also working with tribal partners across our state and working with different tribes and institutions from 6 states, Idaho being one among 6, to particularly look at ways that we might further understanding about STEM practices in Indigenous communities. And we'll explain, much of the first half of our presentation will explain how we've come to this work. But largely what we're going to talk about today is a process of collaboration, and talk about it in ways that are conversational, because that reflects a lot of the actual on the ground work that we're doing. And the way that we've decided to frame this work, which we're excited to share, is to tell you the story of this collaboration and to talk about the ongoing ideas, struggles, priorities that are part of what we call a work in progress. And as we describe our research stance, we might project onto how these lessons we think inform broader processes of research. So to begin with, we're gonna pass to Sarah to begin to tell part of the story of this collaboration.
Okay, so back in 2018, a group of us participated in a Native STEM Education Summit. And the objective of the summit was to address the broadening participation challenge of increasing engagement of Native Americans in STEM. And the summit was hosted by EPSCoR, and EPSCoR is the established program to stimulate competitive research. And EPSCoR is NSF-funded program, and it's designed to enhance research competitiveness of targeted jurisdictions by strengthening STEM capacity and capability. And EPSCoR also has a long history of working with tribes and underrepresented groups, and we strive to broaden participation of diverse groups in STEM. So of the 27 EPSCoR jurisdictions or states, 8 of these state teams were present at the summit. And the 8 teams that were present represented 53% of the total Native American population in the US. And each state took a team, I guess, with them to Montana, and included a K-12 educator, tribal college faculty, higher ed faculty, all with expertise in working with Native populations. So pictured here are 2 members of our Idaho team. Maggie Picard on the left is Northwest Indian College STEM faculty on the Nez Perce Reservation. And on the right is Carol Perkins, who was at the time a Shoshone-Bannock tribe math teacher. And not pictured is Dr. Vanessa Anthony-Stevens and myself, but we were also part of this Idaho team. Next slide. There we go. So using the results of the summit, a common agenda was established. So to pursue this collective impact effort, Idaho and 5 other states continue to meet in an effort to seek funding to address some of these challenges. And that includes, this NSF includes alliance funding. And due to EPSCoR's broad statewide structure, it kind of served as a natural backbone organization to help facilitate these efforts. So at this phase, we also recruited some additional members into the Idaho team based on our state's strength and focus of the Alliance. So Idaho has a growing cadre of emerging Indigenous STEM scholars and educators who are poised, to contribute to STEM innovations from the Indigenous perspective. And so at that point, we recruited Dr. Philip Stevens, who is the director of AIS program and specializes in research focusing on educational disconnect, between dominant cultures and Indian communities. And then also Dr. Karla Eitel, who specializes, as she said, in place-based education, STEM identity and engagement of underrepresented groups. And so this is joining Vanessa and myself. And Vanessa, I don't know if she already mentioned this, but as the director of the Indigenous Knowledge for Effective Education program, IKEEP, that prepares and certifies culturally responsive teachers to meet the unique needs of Native students in K-12 schools. So this served as our Idaho Circled Alliance team, and then we recruited our tribal partners within the Nez Perce, Coeur d'Alene, and Shoshone-Bannock tribes, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. Next.
Philip, are you able to unmute?
Yeah, sorry about that. And I also can't see the notes on this end, so that's going to be fun. But I think one of the things that we really want to get across is this idea is why now? Why are we looking at these things? And to be honest, I believe that that's one of the, I don't know, the way I would describe it is the funny quandaries with this program is that it's always now. Within Indigenous communities, the interactions with Eurocentric communities, it's always now. And there's always been collaborations and difficulties. And I think that what we, as a group, why we're looking at this is really trying to build off of the knowledge systems of so many Indigenous communities. And I think that, and even within the discussion of how we're going to present this, even now, it becomes so difficult to make what would, on my eye, be the simple assertion that that communities such as mine have science and math, but how we deal with these ideas is in a very different understanding, a very different conceptualization of that, which then brings up these other axioms that, the way the science and mathematics are presented in schools, that they're socially constructed. And I think that's what we're looking at, is trying to be able to create an opportunity, intellectual diversity, if you want to think of it that way, to include other Indigenous ways of looking at it. And in that way, there's this the inclusion of Indigenous sovereignty, to be able to ultimately be able to grow together and to have access to these different lenses that are out there. We also want to make sure that that the story isn't just about what I always think of as like the sepia tone, feather and leather indigeneity, that of the past. And then we start really looking at, we don't look at the dynamic nature of Indigenous communities and dynamic nature of knowledge systems that are there. Instead, what we look at tends to be really static understandings of knowledge, and which then kind of, in my opinion, brings forth these ideas of damage-centered research frameworks, you know, these ideas, everything from linguistics, like saving endangered languages. It's from that point of view. Whereas, you know, there's so much vibrancy within communities that we can build off of now. We also want to, again, call attention to these ideas, like the idea of the land grab or land grant universities, and really trying to call attention to these things that are aren't being seen, aren't being recognized. So that's kind of just a quick general idea of this.
So for myself, so I'm an educational anthropologist, but I work primarily in contexts that are looking at K-12, institutional education or higher education. And one of the things that we frequently find in funding proposals that are run by institutions and the ways in which institutions such as the National Science Foundation approach opportunities to fund communities that are historically marginalized is in ways that Philip described, beginning with the deficit and beginning with oftentimes slides and narratives of the ways in which Native people and Native students have been failing at school. And one of the things that we've decided in our collaboration that we want to bring to this local and broad collaboration that we're part of is attention to the underlying epistemologies, the underlying histories, and the underlying legacies that are part of the work that we need to consider as we begin to reframe or reconceptualize community partnerships. So as we think about ways that we want to leverage opportunities like EPSCoR and NSF funding, like collaborations across institutions and tribal nations, one of the things that has been important to Why Now in terms of the work that we do is keeping in mind a historicity of what we're doing. So for as an example, my work in school context, so often in K-12 context, often describes achievement as reflected in what we today call standardized tests, which are discrete measurements of reading literacy skills in English and math skills in English in very particular ways. And one of the things I like to ask educators and knowledge producers, which is any human, of course, but particularly when we think about research, is to think about where the ideas that we are drawing from come from. And so in the work that we're doing, as we think about what collaboration means, we don't want to be ignorant or silent to the realities of 600 years. We don't want to negate the fact that many of the institutions and the frameworks that are funding this work, that are giving us the resources right now to even have this kind of communication at a distance, are framed by histories that have worked to delegitimize Indigenous people, to engage in practices of genocide and dispossession of land, and that our institutions such as schools, including our institutions of higher ed, have been primary tools in institutionalizing racism, in normalizing colonial dispossession and colonial dominance. So that's not to say that these are the kinds of histories that we are looking at every day as the first and foremost conversation that we're having in collaborative spaces. But without acknowledging those spaces, we don't believe, without acknowledging those histories, we don't believe that collaboration can be equitable and healthy. And to that end, when we talk about STEM, which is frequently talked about in ways that ask us to, and I will say this very bluntly, ask us to, in schooling and higher ed, to say, what do we need to do to get more Native people to assimilate or become like the kinds of scientists that we are used to seeing? When we talk about science in its broad senses, we also have to acknowledge the ways in which it has been and continues to be a normative tool of interrupting the very life ways and practices that have kept Indigenous people healthy and connected to landscapes, and has wreaked havoc in many ways in our region and beyond. And I don't put these pictures up here to say these are the only ways that science has been used in Indian country, but they are certainly a phenomenon of colonial logics that is cross-cutting in our nation and globally. And that these are not only abstract concepts that have particular spaces and moments in history, they are ongoing and normative processes that we recognize are happening around us and impacting us every day. So again, as we think about what collaboration means, these are parts of the legacies in contemporary life that we want to be aware of. And that brings us to the role that we play in this larger alliance. Much of why we've kind of brought this idea to interdisciplinary research is to think about the ways in which our different vantage points help us to see how epistemological underpinnings, right, are part of every way that we come to inquiry, but also that those shape what we might be able to see. So those beliefs and assumptions about knowledge and values shape the kinds of questions that we're asking, and that inherently shapes the kinds of responses or the kinds of implications, outcomes that we might discover. So in an effort to what we call flip the script on normative discussions of access and inclusion, one of the curiosities that we have with this project, and we don't mean it just as an abstract intellectual process, we mean it as an everyday actionable process, is to ask ourselves, to begin the ways that we tell our stories and ask questions about STEM processes, to begin with questions such as how might STEM be transformed by Native knowledge and practices, rather than the question of how can we support Native students to access STEM. And while that might be for some a question of semantics, we see it as a question of discourse and imaginaries, right? That if we're beginning conversations, and some of you may be very familiar with Chimamanda Adichie's very, very popular TED Talk on the danger of a single story, the ways in which we begin conversations frame power and frame the very materiality and the values of that materiality around us. So asking what is it that we need to do to get more Native people to be in the institutions as they are inherently assumes that the institution is serving Native people, as opposed to beginning with what is it that Native people are doing, in what ways are they using their knowledge for healthy lifeways or for sustainability, and what is it that STEM can learn from that, and how might STEM be transformed by epistemic diversity in a more nuanced and broader sense. And so for Philip and I, and Karla as well, and Sarah, we all have education backgrounds. We all have degrees in education, at least one of our degrees. You know, we draw a lot from educational scholarship. So those who are looking at knowledge production processes, looking at learning theory, looking at the ways that institutions produce power and knowledge, and thinking about what it would mean in the academy, particularly those who can become PIs for projects such as those funded by the National Science Foundation. You know, what does it mean to participate in status quo research? And what might it mean if we flip the script? So we draw on scholarship that helps us to think about and challenges us to think about uprooting Eurocentric normative assumptions about how we know things, and beginning to think about how we might create more diverse spaces of learning. And that certainly involves risk, and it involves mapping space in ways that are not typically the kinds of spaces that we frequently imagine for university level researchers. So this is you, Philip.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we really want to get across, is this idea that what we're calling flipping the script on Indigenous knowledge. You know, the quote being that Indigenous science refers to knowledge systems unique to each Indigenous people that are used to ensure the flourishing of community, health, livelihood, vibrancy, and self-determination. I think that, and we'll get at this point a little bit later on, is that this advocacy for what could be thought of as the expansion of science, I guess we need to start off with this idea that right now, because science and what's being taught within the school is, it's developed within a particular social and a cultural viewpoint of the world. Right now, it's decidedly a very much a Eurocentric viewpoint. And there's nothing wrong or bad with that. But I think that what we were trying to get across is this idea that there's other games in town. But with that idea that there's other games in town, some of these objectives will be a little bit different. One of the books that I really enjoy is, I'll show it to you. Hopefully, let me actually get onto my screen. Yeah. And it talks about the history around this area in regards to Celilo Falls and all that it entails. And that's the part that we're trying to communicate is the focus upon an idea like, let's say, sustainable environmental consumption. It's dealt with somewhat as a side product to a lot of actions and a lot of ways of doing and knowledge that has been passed down, from generations that that hits upon that idea, but a little bit at a glance. Because in all honesty, that's not an objective of that community. There's something else that's a little bit different. One of the examples that I use to kind of demonstrate this difference in focus between Indigenous knowledge systems and Western knowledge systems is, from my own experience within schools, I talk about when I was growing. So I went away I was sent basically to a boarding school. I went to a really good school, but it wasn't in my home community. It was in Phoenix. And, I struggled like so many other Indigenous students when they go away into these different educational facilities. I mean, this goes all the way back from, the first contact. Conestoga, who was a chieftain of one of the Eastern tribes, I forget, I think it's the Iroquois Confederacy. He made mention of pretty much the same thing that I'm talking about now. And it's this idea that for me, it was so difficult for me at school because up to that point, the sign of being an adult was when I was going to be able to help out my community, help out my family. But then it became apparent to me that for everybody else at that school, a sign of an adult was when you leave your family. And so for me, that was such an interesting point of view to see that the knowledge that's being taught within school is more for the individual rather than that has emphasis on the individual rather than the community. Whereas for me, the emphasis was placed upon the community, more so than the individual. That's not to say that it's exclusive, that it's only, only for the community and all Indians are, selfless beings. It's not that, but there's an emphasis placed upon that. And so that goes back to what are the objectives? What's the objective of these research data points? And that's where we start having difficulty, especially within these systems that we set up to help facilitate the pursuit of knowledge.
I thought maybe Dr. Sammy Matsaw would be on this call. I'm not seeing him, but I just want to give him a quick shout out as we're using his image and he's familiar with some of these photos.
So a lot of thought and planning went into the development of the Circles Alliance. So we had, as I mentioned, 6 states with each had their own group of educators and faculty and EPSCoR, as part of this process. So for the conceptual framework, participants shared their individual concepts of kind of what they envisioned this Circles Alliance to look like. And so one of my diagrams pictured there, it just depicts how each state could contribute. And from this, the hoop dancer concept emerged. And so, for many tribes in North America, the hoop is symbolic of the never-ending circle of life. Many tribes in North America use, hoop dance and hoops and circles in traditional healing ceremonies. And so the hoops represent, all elements, of this process coming together and being connected. So we also took some time to develop a collaboration plan. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of, moving pieces, when you're working with tribes and, different institutions. As an alliance, we co-created the framework for how we would engage internally and with our tribal partners. And so as a group, we determined, early on that interaction would be guided by an Indigenous framework centered on the 7 R's, respect, responsibility, relationships, relevance, representation, reciprocity, and resilience. And then we also, addressed some other collaboration components as well. We broke off into teams and we all worked together to write this plan. And finally, our circles evaluation team that specializes in Indigenous evaluation processes, has been a participant throughout this whole effort. So we engage in this kind of constant evaluation, utilizing surveys, talk story process, which is interviews with all participants, and really asking the question of what does success look like in 1 year or 5 years and 7 generations, and what important steps in this process need to happen in order for the Alliance to be successful in these areas. Anyone want to jump in on this slide?
I'll add a bit to it. One of the challenges as we have been engaging in these processes is, of course, and we'll speak to this at more length in a few slides, has been the very nature of funding structures. So as we shared earlier, one of our goals has been for our Idaho section has been to work in collaboration with our tribal communities and to support their efforts to define what they believe is important STEM knowledge for their own well-being and what it is that they want institutions to do to best serve their young people and their future leaders. Funding structures don't often work that way. So a program such as NSF that many of you might be very familiar with is often asking for researchers to explain what their objectives and outcomes are before they are even eligible to receive funding. And so one of the, the intricate aspects of this large collaboration is not only that each state or region is overseeing the particulars of its effort and the focus of its effort, but that we have to in some way package what is a very diverse effort into a kind of cohesive proposal, right? So currently we're working off of 1 year of funding, but have used this process, as we'll speak to as we close, to submit a funding proposal for 5 years. But this has been a very challenging process to get to a point where even this slide could be presented.
I kind of jumping in here too. I equate this to somebody asking you to talk about the love that you feel from your mother, your father, or for your children if you have them, but use a spreadsheet.
Okay, so what are we doing with this funding and how are we trying to bring to realization partnerships and use the framework that we've described to support a flipping of the script in Indigenous STEM in our local environment? So as mentioned, we have 3 partners, and we're going to go through each of the partner sites and what they have proposed to do with this particular 1 year funding. So one of our partners is the Coeur d'Alene tribe and particularly the Department of Natural Resources. And they're using this effort to focus on strengthening existing tribal school and higher education partnerships, and interested in understanding what are current areas of Indigenous STEM that the tribe and the department would particularly like to explore. So aspects of their own knowledge that have not been well explored through their department, and to use this opportunity to think about what that might tell them about what opportunities they'd like to see schools take advantage of. So particularly referring to K-12 schools that are serving their tribal citizens. Currently, this effort is being led by Gina Bond and Bobby White, who work in fisheries within the Department of Natural Resources, and they work with outreach. They are working with a collaboration of young adults and others across departments, including the Department of Education in the tribe, to look at the opportunities for community sharing circles, to interview teachers who serve K-12 students, frequently non-native, and to interview young adults who have gone through programs, natural resource programs that have been supported or led by the tribe. They're also interested in carrying out surveys with parents who are the parents of tribal citizens who go to schools in their region, and to do some deep diving with some video documentation around particular facets of their own knowledge systems, and to use that documentation for internal sharing, so to be able to talk with and teach young people about their ways of knowing, so in a sustaining and revitalizing way, and also with the potential to think about how those tools could be taken up in K-12 environments. Because the partnership is also with us by extension, we believe that many of the things that might come out of the research that they're doing would also be impactful for higher education.
So with our Shoshone-Bannock tribal partners, our goal is, to strengthen existing tribal school higher education partnerships and community networking to identify the current new areas of Indigenous and school-based STEM education needs. I shouldn't have read all of that. So our partners with the Shoshone-Bannock, we're working with Jessica James, who is the Shoshone-Bannock Tribal Youth Education Program Manager, and also Sunshine Shepherd, who's pictured here. She's the American Indian Services Pre-Freshman Engineering Program Director. So we're working with them to incorporate circles activities into some of their new projects. And this project is actually very similar to the one that Vanessa just described. With the Shoshone-Bannock, they recently developed a new STEM lab, and they were also selected to be a host for a new mobile Think, Make, Create lab. And so they have a lot of new projects and have already established a lot of great partnerships with INL and other places. And so our work is really going to supplement some of the existing effort. They noted that the piece, that was still missing from their work was knowing how tribal members view STEM. And they've been, the Shoshone-Bannock have been using STEM skills, on tribal lands for generations, as with a lot of tribes, such as, preserving traditional food sources, impact of climate change on plants, restoring tribal lands and rivers. And so it's really important, expanding the knowledge of STEM, I guess, within tribal communities and connecting youth to the Shoshone-Bannock STEM concepts is one of the goals of this partnership.
Yeah, so similarly within the Nez Perce site, so when we were first, all of these projects or current status come out of longstanding relationships in communities. So I think that's an important point to make, is, there's sort of the image of I guess they call it like the parachute researcher who drops in and collects a bunch of data and scoots out of there. So in opposite to that, we're trying to build on longstanding relationships that each of us has within these communities. And so within the Nez Perce site, we've had a collaboration for a number of years, looking at how Indigenous youth think about what it means to do STEM and what they think of as STEM practice, and sort of hoping to expand that concept in ways that are productive for the scientific community to further have epistemological diversity in the ways that the scientific community, the university community thinks about what it means to do STEM. And out of that collaboration came some conversations with folks within cultural resources who said, you know, like, ultimately, I'm not sure how much I care how much a young person identifies with science. I want a young person to identify as Perce, as Nimipu, and to understand how science is a tool that can be used to strengthen their people and their identity as Nimipu. So again, flipping the script of like, instead of thinking about how do we get more Native youth into STEM, it's like, how can STEM, or how can, you know, this thinking about Indigenous knowledge and the STEM that has existed within tribal communities for generations upon generations, and the reason that tribal communities have thrived in landscapes, like how can that be used? Anyway, I'm gonna go on to talk about, so that was really the root of this next generation of, you know, so we went to the education department and said, okay, what would you want to do with this funding? And they said, well, okay, maybe this is best as a collaboration with cultural resources. That evolved into working with an existing project that's a landscape restoration work around climate resilience, and it's using Indigenous science. It's Indigenous science-led restoration. And as part of that, one of the members of that team said, you know, within our community, youth are going to higher ed and they're pursuing science degrees, but they don't always have an understanding of how that relates to coming back and being within the community, to come back home and to do the work that they want to do. And we feel like they need to do that in conversation with their elders and understanding, elders' understanding of them as young people and the elders' wishes for the community, and to think about, like, how can I go on to higher education and use the skills that higher education could maybe, you know, help me with, but with the idea that I'm going for the purpose of coming back and serving my community in these particular ways that my elders have helped me think through, which I think relates to Philip's personal story of his own experience. So this was something that we heard. And so the focus of this work is to connect to existing projects and just help provide some funding so that these conversations between elders and youth can happen, and there can be some documentation that ultimately will be used in various ways that will be defined by the team within the community. We'll talk more specifically about that. So I guess this is where we get to some of the institutionalized barriers. And we say not institution barriers, but institutionalized barriers, because these are not just our institution, these are barriers that exist across many institutions and are they're maybe not seen. So Vanessa addressed the timeline. You know, it's hard to get funding to go and to do collaboration, right? You have to have a plan before you get funding, but how do you make the plan, right? So that involves investment of time and relationship building, and ultimately should be coming from the community, but that also is asking a lot from a community. So having funding that would recognize participation through honoraria or through gift giving that signifies the importance of that relationship. Those processes take time, and there's a mismatch between writing a proposal and doing all of that work, and so that what you're proposing is truly community-based, participatory, and collaborative. Budgets themselves, you know, all of this money goes into these specific categories that have very particular rules that are not specific to our institution, but don't match particularly well with cultural protocols within Indigenous communities. Like what you call things matters, you know, on both sides, right? And so there's ways to make budgets work or those funding categories work, but it puts us in awkward positions of, saying that an elder is going to be having an educational experience with us, which is not right. So one of the things we've also talked about, and feel free, team, to weigh in on more specific examples. Philip, I know you have some, but I just want to point out that one of the things we keep sort of coming up against is, where is the center of gravity? Where is the center of power? Maybe is another way of saying that, but I think of it as center of gravity because it's like it sucks a lot of things in, and it takes time and fighting for resources. Where we feel like, the community should have power and sovereignty to make a lot of determinations that are that prove challenging within the financial structures of the university, or NSF. Philip, I can see you want to say something.
Sure, I'll jump in on here too. I think that I want to preface all of this with something that's self-evident and simple from my perspective, but that may or may not be. But just calling attention to like what we're doing right here, right now, that this isn't normal. This is one way to get information out and knowledge across the folks, but it's not normal. Yet, because of the systems in which we're ascribing, power to, this becomes normalized. And I say that having come back from a ceremony within my tribe, where that center of gravity was shifted to something very different than what we're doing right here. I saw, my father doing science, which sounds so weird to say that, because he wasn't just doing science. He was doing a lot of other things that were embedded within there. This gets to some of the points that we're trying to make, that a lot of this stuff, it's knowledge that's embedded within a certain reality, a certain scenario. It's useful to a certain degree to the effect that you're trying to achieve. I think of it's hard to explain this one scenario, but so in my community, there's an entity called a GON. In English, I guess it would be, well, there's no equivalency within English, but the words that have been used to describe this have been crown dancers, devil dancers, those are some of the things that are used to describe this, and they don't do justice to this whole idea. But in particular, there's this one, again, the English word would be this clown. He's not a clown, but that's the English word for it. And I remember seeing this entity spinning what was essentially an airplane wing, but we don't call it an airplane wing. And it was making a noise, and I saw it fluctuate and bend every time it was spun. That wasn't the whole purpose for that person doing that entity doing that thing. But the knowledge that's embedded with that flexing is something that's part of the whole story. And if you choose to call attention to that, which you can, that's part of the whole bit of it. And I think that's the idea that we're trying to get across within this, and why we have such a difficulty with these institutionalized barriers. A quick short example that I talk about is, with AIST, we have these tribal elders courses where we have tribal elders come in and teach courses here at the university as a visiting professor. And basically what I ask of them is if they're willing to share what Western knowledge, Western universities have misunderstood, misapplied, or just plain old missed about their community. And also on top of that, what they'd be willing to share from their community standpoint, what it means to be a functioning adult. And it's very different. Every single time we've had it, it's very, very different. But to get to that point, to get this person hired, it's so difficult. And some of them are such really weird questions to answer. For example, what governing body bestowed upon this person the title of elder? It's a very different, how that's determined is very different, and it differs for tribe. And so to have this idea of a standardized version to be able to mark down on there in such as a way that you say, oh, I got my eldership or PhD from the University of Arizona. Those are the things that are just such a different way of thinking.
So some of the bridges that we're interested in building address, there's many complexities that Karla and Philip have brought up. And I imagine that there's some people listening right now who are thinking, well, we just have to build structures within the institution to make possible this work, and we can do that. And one of the things that we want to emphasize is that maintaining rigid structures that are built upon very narrow epistemic assumptions takes time and it takes energy, right? And if we think about that as a normative feature of our institutions, it takes energy away from other possible realities, right? So one of the things that we are interested, challenged by as we engage in this work is not only the narrowness of the structures themselves, but understanding the limitations and challenging the limitations of the epistemologies and ontologies and axiologies that underscore them. And these are complex issues that we don't propose have one particular answer. I know we're coming up to the end of time, so we just have 2 more slides.
So the point we want to make with this is just, again, back to the point of flipping the script. I think when we think about the idea of research, there's the version of the parachute researcher dropping into a community, collecting data and leaving, right? And we're saying, okay, the opposite of that. But even within, there's a continuum of sort of relationship between institutions of higher education or research institutions and communities, where maybe it was doing research on people was sort of like an old norm that I think many people have moved away from in favor of doing research for people, for communities. But there's still this embedded colonial idea of like knowing, paternalistic, right? Knowing what's best for a community. I will come in and I'll tell you. And so then the next thing is moving to research with communities. And so an equal partnership. And I think that's kind of where a lot of the norm of participatory and community-based research is going. But ultimately, the vision is that institutions like ours can facilitate research led by communities for communities, and just like we can be a portal to access to resources, right? Or and so that that leads us to like data collection for whom, by whom, and for whom. And in this project, we have continuum of with and led by. And our tribal partners have control over the data that they're collecting, determining what data are generated, who's in the room when the data are being collected, how that's shared, and who has access to what, and then working with us to say, okay, this piece goes beyond this small group or this community group for the larger audience, and then eventually this can be shared nationally, right? And that's just a different order of operations than maybe your typical research style, where the goal is to come in, get to the data so you can have a publication. This may not lead to a publication.
So in closing, one of the things that we hope that you've noticed is that we're not talking about what kinds of findings our partners have. We're not speaking about particularly the work that they're doing. We're talking about a framework And we're also talking about a work in progress in terms of a process. And when we look forward, this is a 1-year grant that we have that, of course, is contextualized in longer and ongoing relationships, but also has been the foundation for a larger grant that we hope will garner continued resources, if not one of those grants, maybe multiple. So we're trying to think about this as integrated, not as isolated. Looking forward, we think of a number of potential implications, hopeful implications for this work. And you see them listed here. And I think we've addressed most of them and what we've described to this point. Philip, I don't know if you want to add something further on this last slide.
One of the questions that came up. I think ultimately, I do want to get across this. I want to send a message of hope, but I also want to make sure that the reality is understood. I think back to what, when I was a grad student, I was teaching this course upon research methods, and in this classroom, I had a mix of how they would be considered like social scientists and other scientists. And so we're talking about qualitative and quantitative methodologies. And I remember, talking about that those frameworks are simply one lens in which you're able to look at the data. And that data, especially the quantified data, isn't in and of itself truth, but rather it's an interpretation upon that reality. Oh man, I struck down the God number for those quantitative scientists. They hated that. And I think that's the thing that we're trying to get across here, is that we have such an ingrained understanding of what science and other STEM fields should look like, that when we even breach the possibility there's other scenarios that we aren't really even familiar with, that it becomes somewhat combative. And I think that what I want to say, though, is that that it's not, hope's not all lost. We're able to work with one another. We just need to make sure that that we're aware that there's other possibilities. Again, that idea, not for, but with, communities.
We are about out of time, and I know I don't know that there's time to take any more questions. Kenton will defer to you on that, but I think on behalf of the group, thank you all for letting us talk through this process. Putting these slides together and coming together with our 4 voices was very beneficial to us, and we hope that in some ways that it's been useful or at least interesting for you all to listen to. And we welcome any further questions. We see a request for the articles quoted, and we'd be happy to share that.
Well, thank you, team, for that informative and somewhat provocative presentation. And I'm just intimidated and amazed at all of the different partnerships that you've created with the regional tribes and across the university and with your sister universities in other states. I wondered, though, if we might just take a couple minutes, and if you wanted to respond to the question that Megan put into the chat, and she's raised several one, but she's issued in, she's interested in how can outsiders remain sensitive to what can be shared, that is contrary to the Enlightenment. Not all knowledge should be shared. So if you wanted to talk about the ways that outsiders might interact with some of these communities. And we can go a couple more minutes, sure.
And I kind of want to just say something really quick about that. I think that question by itself too, again, nothing wrong with it, but that question comes from a really particular mindset. And I think that's what we're trying to describe. That there's other scenarios. A friend of mine, when I first moved here, was asking like how how this person can interact more closely with the tribes and collaborate with them, because they're very much of this idea wanting to be an ally. And my response is to go spend time there with the communities. And that individual, for a lot of very valid reasons, didn't. But they still wanted the resources or the opportunities or the insight or the knowledge that one would get from spending time there. I think within my own community, I'm not a medicine person, but if I were, so that kind of knowledge is a separate knowledge. I shouldn't necessarily mess with that knowledge. I shouldn't try to get that medicine person knowledge, or on this other scenario, like what in my tribe would be like women knowledge. I as a male should not look at that, in those parameters. I shouldn't try to get that knowledge, but rather what I should have is a healthy relationship within those, with the medicine people or with women. That's what should be achieved. And so the question isn't necessarily how is it that I can, get that medicine knowledge, but how can I have that relationship? That's what I don't know. That's how I would frame it a little.
So I want to add to that question, because I am not a tribal citizen. My family comes from a Euro settler history of migration. By the time my relatives got here, they were building upon generations of settlers who had displaced Indigenous people. So we, in the state of Illinois, the state has no federally recognized Indigenous tribal land, and that tells you something about that region. So a lot of my work in this area has been about thinking through the role of non-tribal members of, settler histories in challenging institutionalized racism. And I think I want to echo what Philip said, but add and relate back to what we were talking about. One of the unseen issues of epistemic narrowness, so Eurocentric, highly institutionalized processes of knowledge production. So I'm not suggesting that Euro people only have one way to learn. It's that our institutions have presented a very narrow way of transmitting knowledge, which relies so heavily on language and the direct exchange of language. So this assumption that I could walk into anyone's house and say, tell me everything you know, what should I do, is a very self-centered assumption, right? That takes someone time. That takes someone, what do they know about what you know, right? How are you going to use that information, right? But the research mantra has been very much reliant upon language and direct solicitation, right? So give it to me because I want it, and give it to me in a way that I understand it. And that if it's not fragmented into digestible short bites, it is tossed off as not useful, right? So one of the things that we think epistemic diversity offers, and particularly Indigenous ways of sharing knowledge, is a more multi-sensory process that does not just center on language, right? And so thinking about what relationality means when the direct school type performance of recitation, recall, and memorization is not the center of gravity, but can be a tool in how we generate and transmit knowledge, right? Or readily transmit and generate new knowledge, right? So I think that there's a lot that as people who want to be in alliance type relationships need to think about in terms of the ways that we spend our time, and the spaces in which we interact, and to expand the multimodality of that. Right, and those are quite abstract things to say in language right now, but we perform this in practice and on a regular basis. So as academics, how might we capture that? And can that only come up in the form of written language or spoken presentations, right? I think is one of the challenges that we have.
Thank you for those responses. I think we could probably have an entire conversation on the points you made about the ways that knowledge is gathered and shared and transmitted and recorded. But afraid we're out of time for today. So thank you to our panelists. And before we let them all go, I would like to invite everyone in the audience, if you wouldn't mind turning on your camera and giving them a virtual round of applause for this thorough and thoughtful presentation. and or put up your hand in Zoom. And we wish you well with continued research in these areas, and perhaps in 6 or 9 months, when you have additional findings that you'd like to share, we can arrange for you to visit the Renfrew Colloquium again. Next week, I hope you'll join us for a discussion of Idaho politics in the late 70s and early 80s, focusing on the Church Sims Senate race of 1980 with our presenter, Mark Johnson, author of a new book called The Tuesday Night Massacre. So please join us then. Thank you, everyone, for being part of today's program. It's always great to hear the diversity and variety of scholarship being done across our campus and elsewhere. Have a great afternoon. Enjoy our newly arrived spring, and see you next week.
Thank you.